In little more than a generation, we've gone from the fall of the Berlin Wall and Francis Fukuyama's famous assertion that history had ended with the triumph of liberal democracy. We've gone from that to the rise around the world of the 3 Ps of polarisation, populism, and pessimism. In the disaster of Brexit, with the basement levels of approval for our major party leaders unprecedented in modern times, and in the sense that government is unable to tackle some of the most important issues we face, I think we in England and in the UK have our own version of these democratic ills. Inequality is entrenched. Social mobility has stalled. Public services are crumbling. And all around us are signs of social stress, from violent crime to higher levels of mental illness. And I think whatever happens now with Brexit, there is little evidence that the underlying anger and resentment that fueled it has subsided. Things are bad. But with the effects of Brexit still to play out, with the wounds of this appallingly handled process still raw, with the underlying causes still untouched, and with right-wing populists ever ready to exploit the situation, I fear that things could get even worse. So there seem to be 2 main ways that commentators have responded to the problems besetting liberal democracy. And the first is to treat it as little more than a bump in the road. For liberal warriors like Steven Pinker, who spoke here at the RSA last year, it can seem that we have nothing to be worried about but worry itself. People are healthier, they're better off, they're more tolerant, more peaceful than at any time in our history. To overcome public disillusionment, we merely need to reassert the benefits of market democracies and stop listening to self-serving critics and populists. And in a way, that's not a view that should be ignored. In many ways, people today do have opportunities and a quality of life that a few generations ago would have been viewed with amazement by many. If we want to have hope for the future, it's clear that we do need to acknowledge the progress of the past. And in particular, I think we should recall the achievements of the post-war era, when brave governments rebuilt nations out of the ashes of war, when they increased living standards, they grew modern welfare states and laid the foundations for the personal freedoms and legal rights that we now cherish. But nevertheless, I reject the implicit complacency of that view and its lack of ambition. It misses out the plight of the world's poorest billion. It misses the way our own and other liberal democracies have in recent decades, and particularly the period since the credit crunch, been scarred by entrenched inequality, by rising insecurity, and the devastation of our public services. But also, I reject it because this story of continuous progress has a cruel twist: the growing and devastating impact of market-led economic growth on our environment and the looming climate crisis. The alternative view is more gloomy. It sees no way back for liberal democracy. It predicts a future which involves ever greater polarisation and social conflict, leading eventually to some kind of breakdown. One perhaps in which the role of democracy is downgraded and society is increasingly run by a technocratic elite who may or may not have benign intentions, a kind of one-party rule by Google or Facebook, if you like. And indeed, there are some in the environment movement itself who watch the growing commitment of China to tackle environmental harms and climate change, and then in despair turn their eyes across the Atlantic at a country that increasingly accepts the reality of climate change, but has put a proud denier in office. Now, the evidence used to suggest that democracies were lower emitters, that they were better at taking steps on climate change than authoritarian regimes. But recent research from the University of Gothenburg argues that that's only the case in well-functioning democracies free from corruption. So the point is that it's not simply being notionally democratic that is enough. It's also the quality of that democracy that matters. And that's why I adopt a slightly different position on the crisis of liberal democracy. I think the way to save it is to keep its core principles, of course, free and fair elections, the rule of law, freedom of speech and association, but fundamentally to change the way it works.
My anxiety here is that the great success story of liberal representative constitutional democracy, organised around professional political parties offering programmes using mass communication and organised around elections, the 20th century success story of democracy, one of its great merits was that it serves really effectively as a warning system when things are about to go wrong. So these democracies aren't always the best at coming up with the right solution first time round or even second time round, but they're very, very good at hearing the bad news faster than any rival system. Famously, you do not get famines under this kind of politics. I'm not sure this challenge, the climate emergency, fits that model. The information is all out there, we know it, and here we are behaving like this. And like this, I mean our politics. What if the warning signals aren't working? What if we could carry on like this long past the point where we needed to act? I completely recognize the need for all the things that Caroline talked about, and this system needs all of that. But Extinction Rebellion poses a different kind of challenge about other forms of democratic politics which are much more radical and much more direct. And I think we have to be open to that possibility too, that as we move forward through the next generation or more, there are points at which we mustn't think that democratic reform is all about rescuing this form of politics. We have to be open to the possibility that the 2,500-year story has still got a long, long way to run, and we can be collectively masters of our own fate. But even the 250-year story, and certainly the 50, 100-year story, at some point will need to be replaced by something else.